Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to be answering one of the questions I got over on Instagram, and the question was, how much money do I need in order to start investing in property? Mortgage advisor nor am I a financial advisor. The information that I share here on my channel is based on my own experiences and the research that I've done. If you are interested in taking any of these steps further, I would advise that you go and get partial advice from a mortgage advisor or a financial advisor. Really look at your own circumstances before you step into doing any of these strategies. Not every strategy is perfect for every person, and therefore it is imperative you ensure that you've done your own due diligence to ensure that you're going to be able to move forward with any of these strategies that I speak about. So over on my Instagram channel, if you're not following it, it's at Sharice Rogers Official. I basically put a poll up the other day asking what things are people interested to understand about property. And I actually got an overwhelming response. One of the most common questions I got was how much money do I actually need to begin investing? Which is understandable. You know, property is a big field, and when people start to think about house prices, they're like, how much money do I actually need? And I would say this, it really depends on your motivation, the reasoning why you're actually doing this, and what your long-term goals are going to determine what strategy you use, and therefore that will determine how much money you're going to need in order to begin. So I've broken it out into a number of different areas. So we have residential, where you would effectively leverage your main residence as a long-term investment by leaning on things such as capital appreciation, seeing how the prices rise in the market. That would be your investment strategy with a residential property. But this is something that you yourself would live. You would have this traditional buy-to-let market where you would purchase a property for the purpose of putting in a tenant and basically becoming a landlord. You have a number of different non-traditional strategies such as rent-to-rent, service accommodation, HMOs, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about these, but you approach these in a very different way to this traditional market. And then finally you have commercial, which would be, for example, you purchasing a premises for the use of things such as shops or for basic commercial use, which again is a very, very different thing. Now, across this broad spectrum of strategies, the amount that you need in order to get started will be very different. There is no such thing as no money down for a start. There is always some money involved. It might not necessarily be your money, but there will be some money involved. First of all, it's fair to say you may only need minimal amount of money depending on the strategy, but you will need some money. So let's start with residential. If you think about it historically, when our parents, grandparents, etc. were purchasing properties, they saw that as their nest egg. So a house was a massive investment because that was your inheritance, that was your nest egg, that was something that you put down, you could bank on that. I think it's fair to say that with things such as the crash from 2008 and the potential pending crash that we have on the way, things are changed. People have a very different mindset around property as being your nest egg investment. And this is where you start to think about things such as assets and liabilities. A liability is something that you put money into, but it doesn't give you any return. So for example, if I was to just purchase a car, generally speaking, because I have to pay to maintain the car, it is a liability. However, if that car is bringing me some form of money, so for example, I may use it for business in order to generate income, then that will become an asset. A house can be seen in the same way. So if you purchase a house for the sole purpose of just living in it, generally speaking, that is going to be a liability because you have to work in order to maintain that. You have to work in order to pay the mortgage. You have to work in order to make sure your insurances are covered. Everything is actually covered in the house. However, if you're purchasing the house and it's generating you an income, then it becomes an asset. There are other ways within residential housing where you can actually turn it into an asset for yourself, but we'll cover that shortly. But let's deal with the first bit. How much money do you actually need to start investing if you just wanted to go and purchase a residential property? Now, the minimum is anywhere from 5% upwards. So at the 5% level, we have things such as the shared ownership schemes. These schemes are basically a cross between buying and renting. So typically you'd have a much smaller deposit to put down. So like I said, at this minimum, it generally is around 5%. So effectively, you would put in a 5% deposit, and what that will allow you to do is to purchase between 25%, so a quarter, to 75%, 3/4 of the property. So you would own a percentage of the property, and the other percentage will be owned by whoever you're doing the shared ownership scheme with. Each month you would be paying your mortgage, which would be at a reduced rate because obviously you're owning less of the equity of the property, and you would also be paying a rental amount, and the rental amount will be based on the percentage that is owned by the shared ownership scheme. So for example, if you put a deposit down for a 25% share, you'd be paying a mortgage on the 25% share, and then a rental on the 75% share, set at whatever rate is agreed upon within the actual scheme. This tends to be aimed more for first-time buyers and tends to be kind of like new build developments. And I'll cover more about this in another video, as I had another question which was about, the pros and cons of going by a shared ownership scheme versus buying a house in the traditional way. But that would be the lower end of an investment level. So only 5% is necessary, plus your fees. Now, one thing is always to note, your deposit is going to be a separate amount to your fees. So you have things such as legal fees, searches and stamp duty and etc., and taxes, etc. But like at a basic investment level, if you're just looking at a deposit, 5% is the least amount that you would require. Now, if you went down the traditional route of just purchasing a house via the bank, you would require a minimum of 10% of the purchase price of the property. So, for example, if you were looking at a house that cost £200,000, you would need at least £20,000 minimum as your deposit, plus your fees. One thing to note, when you're working with the bank, when you're actually getting your mortgage, they're working off a loan to value amount. So based on the property price, the bank will have a loan to value. So you have 10% deposit, the loan to value would be 90%. It stands to reason that the higher your deposit amount, the lower your loan to value, i.e. the lower your debt to the bank. And therefore what gives you options, or opens you up to better mortgage products, which means you can have lower interest rates. So your overall debt would cost less. In the sense of the bank, more deposit would equate to less risk. So if we look at an example, so you've gone out and you've seen a house and it costs £100,000. I'm going to use this arbitrary number just because it's just simpler to work out. So £100,000 is the cost of the house, and it's been accepted at. You have £20,000 saved in the bank, and that's what you want to use for your deposit. That means you have 20% deposit saved, which means if you approach a bank for a mortgage, they would only need to lend you 80% of the property value, which means you have an 80% LTV. In the same scenario, if you had £35,000 saved, that would be 35% deposit, and therefore your loan to value, or your LTV, would only be 65%. Now in the second scenario, you would probably get a better interest rate on your product, because again, like I said, the higher your deposit, you would see as less risk to the bank, because they have less money that they need to lend you. Now it's important to note that with the residential mortgage, the way in which the bank will actually work out your criteria as to whether you're suitable for a mortgage product that they might want to lend you, the amount which the bank will actually loan you based on your personal circumstances. So for example, they'll take into account things such as your salary and your earnings, so stuff like commission payments, etc. If you're working within a space where you earn commission, they'll look at your expenses and your current debts. They'll look at things such as your credit score, as well as any other commitments that you may have, and they'll put that into a package to basically build a financial profile, to figure out what type of person you are, what level of risk do you pose to them to lend a certain amount of money. The bank is trying to build a financial profile. They want to get to understand what type of person are you, is their money going to be safe? So before you actually begin your search for property, at the point when you start thinking, you know what, I want to invest in property, I would advise that you do a proper financial audit for yourself, understanding things such as your credit score, work out what your debts are, what other things that you can clear, what other things that you can do to make sure you're in the best possible position to actually leverage these funds. You can also talk to an impartial mortgage advisor who would give you an indication of what type of mortgage you could actually typically access, and that will actually help you as well with your search, because there's no point you going online and start looking at houses that you like just because you like the look of them and you're thinking, oh, I could, maybe I can get this house, which the mortgage would be something like, I don't know, £450,000, but actually when you speak to a mortgage advisor, they say, you know what, you're likely to only get 300, because there's a big disparity there. So it's really important that you kind of understand what you can actually work with. Also, by getting an idea of what type of money you could actually be loaned from a bank, it will also give you an opportunity to kind of look at the type of typical repayments that you would make. So within the residential mortgage space, you have two types of ways in which you can repay the mortgage. You can go repayment, which effectively means every month you're paying a portion of your loan back. So based on the property value of 100k, and you having a potential deposit of £20,000, you need to borrow 80 grand from the bank. Now, once you've borrowed that money from the bank, they will then apply a specific interest rate. So depending on whether that's a fixed interest rate, so basically you have one interest rate throughout the period of the loan, and usually the fixed interest rate is for a short period, so it's either 2, 5 or 10 years. That could be a fixed interest rate. So you mean you have one number that you have throughout that period of the loan, or you have a variable interest rate, which means your interest changes based on the Bank of England's base rate. Now again, I'll cover this as a separate video. Again, if you want more information about that, so look out for that. I will be doing a series on the purchasing a residential home, so I will go over that separately. But just for the sake of this example, we'll just assume we have a fixed interest rate. So based on the £80,000 over a period of 25 years, which is a standard mortgage term, the bank will then say to you, this is how much per month you will need to pay back on a repayment. So it will be anywhere from, at those kind of levels, bear in mind this is cheap in comparison to a lot of places. You'll be looking at maybe £350, maybe about £350 a month. And that £350 a month would include not only a chunk of your equity or the capital of the house, so the £80,000 loan, but it would also include a portion of the interest rate that you would need to pay every month to keep the loan. Therefore, it's kind of important to understand roughly what your repayments would look like, because in that situation, you want to ensure that you're not stretched too thin. If the repayment levels seem very tight, maybe the house that you're looking at might be a bit too expensive, for the simple fact of what would happen if you were suddenly to lose your job, or you find yourself, having to pay a sudden, bill, like something went wrong. As things can happen, what would happen? How would you be able to afford it? So affordability is very, very key. That's what they do as part of their financial profile. They're working out your affordability. Can this person actually afford to repay the loan? If you were looking at interest only, you would only be paying the interest on the loan. So if it's 3%, 4%, 5%, 2.4%, whatever the interest is, each month you're only paying the interest on that loan. And at the end of the 25 years, you would still have the complete amount of the debt to pay. So at the end of 25 years, you would still have maybe £80,000 left to pay back to the bank. So these are things to take into account as well. Again, like I said, I'll cover this in a separate video as well, in the residential purchase process and the pros and cons of each method. I will cover that separately. So let's go back again to another question. Isn't this a liability rather than asset? Like I said, assets put money in your pocket, liabilities take money out. So if you're just purchasing a house just for the sake of living in it, like I said, that will be a liability because you are having to work in order to pay that off. However, you can, in some cases, make your residential property an asset straight off the bat. So it can become an investment purchase. The way in which you could do that is if you were to purchase a below market value property. So for example, if you were purchasing a house and the market value of the house was 100,000, like again we'll use the same example, so 100,000, but you managed to negotiate with the seller for for whatever reason, they might want a quick sale, there might be works that needed to be done in the house or whatever it may be. You wanted to purchase a house for £90,000. Immediately, you have £10,000 worth of equity in the property based on the current market value. So already, you are actually better off. So you have some level of assets and you have equity in your property. Another way in which you can make your residential, as in your main residence, an investment property is by improving the property. So doing some level of improvement which will ultimately increase the value of the property. So for example, you may buy a 1-bedroom flat and through some level of reconfiguring the layout, make it into a 2-bedroom property. That in itself will raise the market value because there's more, you've created something of more demand, so your market value would increase. Or when people do things such as loft extensions, or depending if the house is in a really bad state and they make all the home improvements, that adds equity to your property, adds value to your property, and therefore you have now improved your investment.